You are now listening to the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. All right, everybody, welcome to the third episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. So we're going to do something interesting today. I'm going to be comparing one of the most important books that I've ever read on the book of Revelation, which is by a New Testament scholar named Michael Gorman, called Reading Revelation Responsibly, with Ludwig von Mises, who is a classic Austrian economist, maybe one of the most famous within that tradition. His work, The Anti-Capitalist Mentality. And one of the ideas behind the show today, something that I've noticed in biblical literature as I've read through a lot of biblical critics, is that one of the problems that I see is that while they're very, very good when it comes to interpreting the New Testament, when it comes to applying those New Testament ideas to contemporary economic or political philosophies, there is oftentimes a disconnect. And so we're going to talk about that disconnect a little bit today. The first thing that I want to point out before we begin is recently, I think in March of 2022, I read a book by another Ludwig Wittgenstein, and it was called Philosophical Investigations. And for those of you that are familiar with postmodernist philosophy or with really any 20th century philosophy, Wittgenstein is a scholar a philosopher who thinks a lot about how language actually works. And one of the main ideas of philosophical investigations, really the main idea, is that language has no inherent stable meaning, that there is a disconnect between words and the meaning behind them, because if you think about it, words can be used in an infinite number of contexts and are often open to change and everything depending on the context in which they were used. And so one of the points that Wittgenstein makes in philosophical investigation is that the only way that we can possibly have, kind of coherent conversations, the only way that we can possibly understand what somebody else is trying to tell us, or that somebody else can understand what we're trying to tell them, is if we view language like a game. And so he comes up with the concept of language games, and the entire idea behind that is, since language is subjective and open to change all the time, when you get into a conversation with somebody, both parties need to determine or set the rules of the conversation that they're going to have. And so a part of that language game is defining the words that you are going to use when you have a conversation. And Wittgenstein would say that this is kind of one of the really big problems of human communication, and the reason why human communication breaks down is that you have two people that are talking, but they're both using words and they're both using language and they're both using words, but they're applying different meanings to them. And so it's kind of like they're trying to play a game but following different rules. And so I talked about this at the end of last episode, how there are so many concepts that are just left undefined in popular conversation. And I think two of those terms that we have to get a hold of before we can really launch into our podcast today are the concepts of capitalism and socialism. It's amazing to me, like when you read the news or when you watch TV, these words are thrown around by everybody all the time. Like everyone loves to use the words capitalism and socialism, but they're almost never ever defined in contemporary discourse. Like no one ever steps back and thinks, or no one ever steps back and says, I think we need to define these terms. They just use them without providing a definition, which means that you can make capitalism or socialism mean almost anything you want. So I want to define those two terms today before we get into criticizing the way that New Testament scholars use the term capitalism. So I started going to grad school in 2016. I started grad school and I had to take a class on economics. So believe it or not, I didn't start studying economics formally until about 5 or 6 years ago. That's kind of embarrassing for somebody who is hosting a podcast on libertarianism. But the textbook that we had to use for that class was called The Survey of Economics by Irving B. Tucker. I have it sitting here on the desk next to me. And on pages 498 through 500 in Survey of Economics, Tucker defines these two terms. And I remember reading this for the first time in 2016 and thinking to myself, like, no one has ever just laid out what capitalism and socialism means. And he has a very simple definition of both of these terms. So capitalism, he says, really involves two things. The first is the private ownership ownership of the factors of production. So the things that we use to produce goods and services are privately owned. They're not owned by the government. And that's the first part. And the second part is that the economy is decentralized. There's no central planning committee or a group of people at the top that are making decisions about how the economy ought to best be run. And so the corollary to capitalism is that there's no government control. And so really when you think about capitalism, all that it is an economic system where there's no kind of central direction and where people own their own private property. There's no collective ownership or anything of property. And then you define socialism as being kind of the opposite or the inverse of that socialism is a system where all of the factors of production are publicly or governmentally owned, and all economic decisions are centralized. So you might have economic planners or people that are in the government coming together and making decisions about how to allocate resources and things of that nature. And socialism does imply some sort of government control of the economy. And so when I talk about these two concepts to my students in class, I kind of look at capitalism and socialism on a sliding scale. And so in my class, I have my students take a piece of blank paper and turn it horizontally, and they draw a dot on the left side and a dot on the right side, and I have them label the left side socialism and the right side capitalism, and they draw a line from one side to the other. And I explain how, if you think about capitalism and socialism more as a spectrum, more as a sliding scale, if you're a full-blown socialist, then you think that the government or that we collectively as a society should own all of the factors of production and make centralized economic decisions. And if you're a pure capitalist, you believe that the factors of production should be privately owned and that there should be no centralized economic decision making. And in reality, most people in the United States fall somewhere in between. And that leads us to our problem that we're going to deal with today, is that there are a lot of people that consider themselves capitalists that are actually okay with quite a bit of government interference in the market. And there are a lot of people that consider themselves to be socialists that actually enjoy and think that private property and some decentralized economic decision-making is a good thing. And so for the majority of Americans that aren't like hardcore, kind of Misesian libertarians like me, the majority of Americans fall somewhere in between being purely capitalistic and purely socialistic. And the problem is when they don't look at these two concepts as being the extreme ends of a sliding scale. And so you can attribute all kinds of bad things to capitalism or socialism that aren't necessarily true of either of those systems. Now, you're never going to hear me defend socialism on this show. I do think that there are a lot of people that believe in social controls because they think that it will make the economy better, and fair enough. Like, we should respect that there are people that believe in more of a socialist economy and that they're coming to that belief with a good intention and with a good heart. But that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to agree. It doesn't mean at all that I'm going to agree with the concept of socialism. So as we move into our comparison of these two scholars today, Michael Gorman and Ludwig von Mises, I want you guys to keep those those understandings of capitalism and socialism in mind. That all that capitalism is an economic system where the factors of production are privately owned and economic decisions are not made from the top. They're made by private organizations, by individuals, and how they spend their money, things like that. So Ludwig von Mises and Michael Gorman. So Michael Gorman is one of my absolute favorite New Testament scholars. As I said on the show last week, he wrote what to me has been maybe the most important book on New Testament ethics I've ever read, Cruciformity. And if you're interested at all in how Christians ought to live out their faith based on the teachings of the New Testament, Michael Gorman's book, Cruciformity, is absolutely essential reading. Just a giant paradigm changer for my life. And Michael Gorman has done a really good job of presenting a lot of those ideas in his other work. And I believe he teaches at St. Mary's Seminary, which is in Maryland, maybe. And Michael Gorman, I think, comes from kind of like a Wesleyan, maybe even a little Anabaptist background. And so there are a lot of aspects of Michael Gorman's work, as we're going to see today, that I think are really admirable and really appealing from a libertarian perspective. Michael Gorman is consistently anti-war. He's consistently anti-empire. And so there's a lot to respect about his work. work. And in fact, the only thing that I'm going to argue today is that he doesn't make the proper connections between kind of that anti-empire, anti-war, and capitalism. That capitalism is kind of the best economic system for given his interest in the way that the state should operate and things like that. Ludwig von Mises, on the other hand, is kind of the father of the Austrian School of Economics, and the Austrian School of Economics is kind of like a radical capitalist school. The Austrians tend to believe that individuals are in the best position to make economic decisions that are in their own interest, and that an economy functions the best when there's no outside interference. And so we talked about Murray Rothbard on last show. I know that we will have an episode on F.A. Hayek's The Road to Serfdom at some point. I'm not even sure if you can consider yourself a libertarian if you haven't read that book. But Ludwig von Mises is kind of like the godfather of the Austrian movement. And so we're going to compare what he says in a book called The Anti-Capitalist Mentality with what Michael Gorman says about capitalism in his book, Reading Revelation Responsibly. And so Revelation, for those of you guys that are coming to this podcast from maybe more of a libertarian perspective, and you might not be very familiar with the Bible, almost everyone knows that the book of Revelation is the last book of the Bible, and very popularly at the end of the last century, the end of the 1990s, it was made into a book series and a movie series called Left Behind. Now, I would argue, and I think most New Testament scholars would argue as well, that Left Behind in no way reflects what the book of Revelation actually teaches. And I think one of the things that Michael Gorman does admirably in this book, Reading Revelation Responsibly, is try to overcome a lot of the popular myths that people have about the book of Revelation and what we might call apocalyptic literature in the Bible in general. So before we do that, Michael Gorman does provide a pretty good definition and overview of apocalyptic literature at the beginning of his book, Reading Revelation Responsibly, because the book of Revelation is an example of Second Temple Jewish apocalyptic literature. And so it might be helpful to define what we mean by that before we get into our book. And so apocalyptic kind of works on two different levels. It was a way that people in the ancient world, particularly Jews of the Second Temple period, would talk about certain events that were happening in the world. And so apocalyptic works on two levels. The first level is that it's a type of discourse, or it's a type of way of talking about things. And then the second level is apocalyptic as a genre, where they use a certain way of talking about events in the world and then kind of elevate that into a particular way of writing about those events. And so the basic idea behind apocalyptic literature and apocalyptic discourse or language in general is that it is a deliberate use of symbolic imagery to give theological significance to real world events. And this is the goal of Revelation. It is an example of apocalyptic literature where the writer of Revelation, John, is using a lot of symbolic imagery and a lot of symbolic language to refer to things that are happening in the real world. So events that were taking place at the end of the first century in the Roman Empire. And so the goal of Revelation is not necessarily to predict the future. And in fact, if you read the end of the book of Revelation where God creates the new heavens and the new earth, that was a belief that was shared by basically all Christians. They didn't need really any more content about that. The goal of the book of Revelation is both, as Michael Gorman says, to comfort the church by reminding them that God is eventually going to make everything right, and then to challenge them to stand up and be critical of the things that were happening in the world around them. And really the root or the foundation of apocalyptic language goes back to the prophets in the Old Testament, where they use all kinds of symbolic imagery to describe things that were happening in the real world during their time. And so apocalyptic is inherently political and cultural because it is a way of speaking about things in symbolic language, but it describes events that are taking place in the real world. And the idea behind this is just like if you listen to a really good song on the radio, you find like your favorite song, chances are the writer of that song is going to use symbolic language to talk about real world events. This is really what like poetry is all about. It's using language it's not just a literal use of language, but sometimes using symbolism and using imagery does a more powerful job of conveying meaning than simply saying something as it is. And so the entire idea behind apocalyptic language, apocalyptic literature, and the book of Revelation in particular is to use that symbolic imagery to describe events that were taking place in the real world. Very famously, Revelation opens up as a letter to 7 churches in Asia Minor, which is modern-day Turkey, and the goal, as Michael Gorman says, is to comfort and challenge those believers, that the believers that are there need to be comforted in the midst of all of the trials that they're facing with problems that are going on in the Roman Empire at that time, and also to give them hope for the future, and then to challenge them to continue to be faithful despite everything that they are dealing with. Now, as I said before, you need to pick up a book of reading Revelation responsibly. It's an excellent introductory commentary towards Revelation, especially if you're new to the New Testament. It's just a great overview and a really easy way into that book. And again, like Revelation is really, as Michael Gorman says, a critique of the Roman Empire. It talks a lot about the problems of kind of an all-powerful state who wants to destroy people's ability to honor God and to live out their faith and to live out their values. And so to that extent, Revelation really is a critique of human power. And there are so many good libertarian adjacent ideas in reading Revelation responsibly. As I said, Michael Gorman, based on his reading of Revelation and other New Testament texts, is anti-war. He has a lot of great content about anti-imperialism. All of these things are incredibly congenial to a libertarian perspective. There's not a lot to disagree with. And he says deliberately on page 43 in reading Revelation responsibly, that I'm going to quote him right here. It says, Revelation is a theopolitical text. It makes claims about who is truly God and about right and wrong connections between God and the socio-political order. It challenges the political theology of empire and the religious ideology that underwrites it, and it reveals God and the Lamb alone as the true sovereign one, source of all blessings and proper object of worship. As a Protestant libertarian, that's perfect. I believe that Jesus is the king. I believe that God created the world. Therefore, I'm not going to worship the state. And I have a responsibility to be critical of that state. If Jesus is the king, Michael Gorman is implying here, that relativizes all human power. So far, so good. Again, you read the first several pages of Michael Gorman's Reading Revelation Responsibly as a libertarian, there's not going to be a lot that you're going to disagree with. The problem, however, is when it comes to capitalism. And I'm going to read what Michael Gorman says on page 44 about capitalism here. He's actually referring to another scholar named Craig Kester, who has some good work on Revelation as well. And he says here that Craig Kester notes that and this is page 44, Craig Kester notes that the empire addressed in Revelation consists of 3 inseparable components, all of which are challenged by the book: political dominion, religion in which the political order is identified with the divine, and economic networks that favor the elite and permitted human exploration. All right. And so again, the first 2 elements of that, political domination, identifying the political order with the divine order, both of those are problematic. And then economic networks that favor the elite and permit human exploitation. Now, if you read that statement about economics from a libertarian perspective, you're automatically going to think about socialism. If you look back at the history of the 20th century, it has actually been socialism that has favored the elites and the societies that have tried to implement them, and that have led to an unbelievable amount of human suffering and exploitation. But unfortunately, Michael Gorman goes on and he says here on 44, most of these interpreters also draw connections between aspects of the Roman Empire and forms of empire today. And here it is: the global capitalist economy. And then he adds, to be fair, and the powerful military, political, and economic reality that is the United States of America. These two are not unrelated, as he says. Now, I'm not sure about you, but when I think about the economic policies that were pursued by the Bush administrations and the Obama administrations, there's not a whole lot of good capitalism going on in either of those administrations. And obviously, Michael Gorman, I think he wrote this book in maybe 2012 or 2013. It might be a little more recent than that. And so he's thinking back about the political developments in America over the first decade of the 21st century. And he's identifying capitalism with the wars that the United States has launched all over the world. And again, from a libertarian perspective, is there really a connection there? I mean, if the whole reason why the United States has all of these military excursions around, or if one of the reasons why the United States has all these military excursions around the world is to try to get resources from other countries, isn't that a form of centralized economic planning? And aren't we denying those countries the right to, having private ownership of the factors of production there? Like, in my perspective, Michael Gorman's use of the term capitalism here does not square with the definition of capitalism that's offered in my introductory economics textbook. And this is one of the problems with biblical scholars. I think that when you look at the news and you think about the way that people have talked, critics in particular have talked about capitalism has kind of just always been associated with like greed and consumerism and materialism. I mean, before I read this introductory textbook on economics, I thought the exact same thing. Like, I just assumed that capitalism was essentially a synonym for greed or exploitation or something like that. But when you look at what the word actually means, all it means is decentralized economic decision-making and factors of production that are privately held. Like, there's nothing about greed or anything in the definition of capitalism that would square with the definition that Michael Gorman provides on page 44 of his book. The capitalism is some form of political domination. In fact, if you think about it, capitalism is kind of the opposite, because as an economic system, it does everything that it can to push politics out of the economy. That with capitalism, again, based on the fundamental definitions that we outlined at the beginning of this podcast, capitalism does not try to impose any sort of system or any sort of ideas onto other people. And so this is a big problem. Now, Michael Gorman says he makes his claim about capitalism as he's kind of introducing the book of Revelation. And then he gets into his interpretation of kind of the heart of the book of Revelation. And so if you've ever read Revelation before, you have the epistolary or the letter portion of Revelation, which is Revelation 1, 2, and 3. And then you have the center of the book of Revelation, which is Revelation 4 and 5. And that is where, using apocalyptic language, John is placed before God's throne room, and he sees that Jesus has died but has overcome the world, and then Jesus is kind of the lamb that was slain, but also the lion, and that because Jesus has died and been raised from the dead and has ascended to the throne, Christians can be guaranteed that God is going to bring about justice for all of those who serve him. And Michael Gorman, he calls this kind of the central vision of the book of Revelation, that the center of Revelation is 4 and 5, where God is clearly declared king through the Messiah, or God is clearly the creator of the world, and Jesus is clearly the king of the world through his life, death, resurrection, and then ascension to heaven. And so chapters 6 through 20 are an apocalyptic outworking of the meaning of Jesus' death, resurrection, and ascension. And it's essentially a critique of the Roman Empire, which is based on the reign of Christ and his body, which is the church. And everything in chapters 6 through 20 is meant to be symbolic, and almost definitely has some sort of first century reference. And in Revelation 18, we read that the great city of Babylon, which is 100% a cipher for Rome in the book of Revelation, will eventually be overthrown, and all of the merchants and the traders that did business with Rome will be sad and upset because kind of the conduit for business, which is described as Babylon, which again is a cipher for Rome in the book of Revelation, will have collapsed. And so Michael Gorman comments on this in Revelation 18, and I would highly recommend, if you've not read it, maybe pause this podcast, go grab yourself a Bible or go to BibleGateway.com and type in Revelation 18. Michael Gorman kind of uses this as a conduit to talk about economics and things like that. So I'm going to read kind of a longer-ish section from Michael Gorman here on his understanding of economics. So he says this, starting on page 148. Assuming that many of us, in certain ways, have in fact entered Babylon, which again is a cipher for Rome in Revelation, what might it mean to come out? One aspect of coming out that is central to Revelation is economic, which can be considered on the individual, family, and congregational levels. Economic faithfulness has to do minimally with how we earn our money and what we do with it once we have earned it. And then he references another scholar. He says, suggests that the two beasts of chapter 13 can be interpreted as capitalism and consumerism. And David De Silva reminds us that John understood that a person cannot share in the profits of domination without also sharing in its crime. So again, connecting capitalism with consumerism and capitalism with domination and economic exploitation. If Christians should not engage in sex in the same kinds of ways as the Gentiles who do not know God, then neither should we engage in commerce as if we were non-believers. And then he says this: while few Christians today would question the appropriateness of teaching in secular schools as a vocation and things of that, perhaps at the very least, Christian teachers should question and come out from some of the values and practices inscribed in many secular and even Christian forms of education. Again, Michael Gorman here is talking about the way that we think and educate ourselves on issues like this. And then he goes on to say this: it would be easy to assume that most careers and day-to-day practices are exempt from the critique and revelation, but revelation will not allow us to be so naive. If it involves buying or selling goods, revelation subjects it to question. Is this a business that directly or indirectly promotes the rich and exploits the poor? Does it harm the earth or other human beings? If so, then Revelation 18 addresses it. Churches, too, need to consider carefully the sources and means of their income, whether local fundraising techniques such as flea markets or silent auctions or fashion shows. And here we go. Revelation 18 also raises the question about how we spend the money we have earned. Like the economy judged in Revelation 18, many contemporary economies are based on lust, domination, and exploitation, even human trafficking. We may live in just such an economy where more is always better and sex consistently sells, and we may inadvertently support other economies where the poor are exploited or even traded. Alternatively, we might turn a blind eye to the existence of economic justice wherever or whether nearby or far away. As individuals, families, and churches, we are shaped in the West by consumerist, anti-God, and anti-human values that oppose the very essence of the gospel. Do our ways of spending benefit the least? Do they promote justice and healing? Do they reflect convictions about the reign of God and the Lamb? Or do they reflect the values and practices of Babylon and those who do not know God? So that's Michael Gorman's critique of economics there, which, as we've seen, is connected with his definition of capitalism. But again, I want to go back to the idea that if capitalism is this decentralized system where individuals own the means of production and there's no centralized economic decision-making, isn't that actually kind of the best form of economics from a Christian perspective? Because if there's no one from above kind of coordinating economic activity, then Christians should be free to open their own businesses where they can run them in a way that reinforces or that upholds their Christian values. And I think this idea that capitalism, whatever Michael Gorman might mean by that, is inherently exploitative and inherently unjust. It just does not match up. It does not square up with the basic definition of capitalism as a decentralized economic system. Now, there are going to be plenty of people in a decentralized economic system that are going to use power and privilege for their own gain. But then, like, as consumers, if you realize that, you're free to turn away from those systems. And in a socialist system, if you have economic planners that are making decisions about how the economy ought to be run, and they decide that they're going to throw their energy and their politics behind businesses that are inherently uncorrupt, as consumers, we have no other options. The beautiful thing about capitalism is that it gives everybody the option to make what they want, to provide the services in whatever way they want, to pay their employees however much they want, and then from the consumption side, to purchase whatever they want. And I just don't think that Michael Gorman's understanding of capitalism as this inherently exploitative system holds up to a real definition of capitalism. And I completely agree with what Michael Gorman says at the end there, that Christians really should think about the economic impact of their decisions. Like, as Christians, if we know that there are businesses that are acting corruptly, we should probably think twice about supporting them with our money. But the beautiful thing about that is that we as Christians get to make that choice. Like, no one forces us to make those decisions. And again, we can have a conversation and have thoughts about how that money is best to be spent. And I think one one of the problems with Michael Gorman's perspective here, and with a lot of these New Testament scholars that he quoted in there, is they do a great job of criticizing empire and kind of criticizing this imperialistic expansion of the United States. But the implicit solution for all of these scholars is to give more power, more economic power to the same governments they are trying to critique. Okay, if people are greedy and exploit one another, then maybe we should allow the government to step in and tell them they can't be greedy and exploit other people. But that's giving that power over to those that are in charge that we know are already greedy and corrupt. It just doesn't make any sense from my perspective. And I think what Michael Gorman is really criticizing here are the bad behaviors that a lot of people engage in, but that's not a reflection of capitalism. If you, again, go back and look at the basic definition of capitalism. So this is where we're going to bring in Ludwig von Mises to kind of tie all of this together. Mises has a really great definition of capitalism on the first page of his book. And again, this is the anti-capitalist mentality. And he says this: the characteristic feature of modern capitalism is mass production of goods destined for the consumption by the masses. The result is a tendency towards a continuous improvement in the average standard of living, a progressing enrichment of the many. Capitalism deproletarianizes the common man and elevates him to the rank of the bourgeois. And one of, again, Mises's great definitions of capitalism, going right back to what they said in my introductory textbook, is that it is a system where people are free to make whatever they want, and on the consumption side, people are free to buy whatever they want. And he makes the case over and over again in this book that capitalism, when properly understood, has actually been the system that makes better off. And then he talks about profits and things like that on page 2. He says the profit system of capitalism makes these men prosper who have succeeded in filling the wants of the people in the best possible and cheapest way. Wealth can be acquired only by serving the consumers. And that's the idea behind capitalism, that a lot of, and you don't just have to be kind of a Misesian capitalist. There are plenty of other ways to look at this. But in a capitalist system, businesses are competing for the money of the consumers that they want to buy from them. And they're also competing for labor. They're competing for the best employees that will allow them to produce the goods and services that people want at the lowest possible costs. And so Mises is going to argue throughout this book that the profit system, it makes everyone better off, because as an employee, if a company really wants you, they're going to treat you well, or they're going to treat you better than you might be able to get if you went and worked at another company. It's the same thing as a consumer. If you have companies that are competing with one another for your business, they're going to try their best to offer you the greatest product at the lowest possible price. And Ludwig von Mises says that that system makes everyone better off when the economy is allowed to run on its own without any outside interference, which is all that capitalism is. Again, we have to take all the morality and everything out of capitalism. I do want to take a look, though, at a longer-ish section in Mises's book that directly deals with one of the issues that Michael Gorman raises in Reading Revelation Responsibly, and that is the issue of capitalism and injustice. And so he deals with this in a section in a chapter of this book called The Non-Economic Objections to Capitalism. He has a section 3, called Injustice, and this is on page 80 in his book. And I'm going to read a little bit of this to you guys, and we're going to start to piece together, I think, this connection between Michael Gorman and Ludwig von Mises. And he says this: the most passionate detractors of capitalism are those who reject it on account of its alleged injustice. It is a gratuitous pastime to depict what ought to be and is not, because it is contrary to inflexible laws of the real universe. Such reveries may be considered as innocuous as long as they remain daydreams. But when their authors begin to ignore the difference between fantasy and reality, they become the most serious obstacle to human endeavors to improve the external conditions of life and well-being. The worst of all these delusions is the idea that nature has bestowed upon every man certain rights, and then he goes on to talk about how people believe that they have a right to, and this is not saying that people don't have a right to the property that they purchase, but that people have a right to be given property by those that are outside. And he says the eternal laws of natural and divine justice require that nobody should appropriate to himself what by rights belong to other people. The poor are needy only because unjust people have deprived them of their birthright. It is the task of the church and secular authorities to prevent such spoliation and to make all people prosperous. So this is the delusion that he talks about, the idea of injustice, that everyone has a right to just have things given to them, and that the task of the church and the government is to prevent people from not getting the thing that they want. He then goes on to say, every word of this doctrine just outlined above is false. Nature is not bountiful but stingy. It has restricted the supply of all things indispensable for the preservation of human life. It has populated the world with animals and plants to whom the impulse to destroy human life and welfare is inwrought. It displays powers and elements whose operation is damaging to human life and to human endeavors to preserve it. Man's survival and well-being are an achievement of the skill with which he has utilized the main instrument with which nature has equipped him, reason. Men, cooperating under the system of division of labor, have created all the wealth which the daydreamers consider as a free gift of nature. With regard to the distribution of this wealth, it is nonsensical to refer to an allegedly divine or natural principle of justice. What matters is not the allocation of portions out of a fund presented to man by nature. The problem is rather to further these social institutions which enable people to continue and to enlarge the production of all the things that they need. He's then going to turn on the churches. He says this: the World Council of Churches, an ecumenical organization of Protestant churches, he's trying to attack people like me, and he's going to be right here, declared in 1948, justice demands that the inhabitants of Asia and Africa, for instance, should have the benefits of more machine production. This makes sense only if one implies that the Lord presented mankind with a definite quality of machines and expected that these contrivances will be distributed equally among the various nations. Yet the capitalistic countries were bad enough to take possession of much more of this stock than justice would have assigned to them, and thus to deprive the inhabitants of Asia and Africa of their fair portion. What a shame. He then critiques this and says, the truth is that the accumulation of capital and its investment in machines, the source of the comparatively greater wealth of the Western peoples, are due exclusively to laissez-faire capitalism, which the same document of the churches passionately misrepresents and rejects on moral grounds. It is not the fault of the capitalists that the Asiatics and Africans did not develop these ideologies and policies which would have made the evolution of autochthonous capitalism possible. Neither is it the fault of capitalists that the policies of these nations thwarted the attempts of foreign investors to give them the benefit of more machine production. It is nonsensical to blame capitalism and the capitalistic nations of the West for the plight of the backwards people have brought upon themselves. The remedy indicated is not justice, but the substitution of sound, i.e. laissez-faire policies for unfair policies. Really, really powerful stuff here. And again, he's going to criticize at several points in the anti-capitalist mentality, kind of this reflexive Christian idea that whenever there's any sort of economic inequality, that it's a kind of a theologized justice issue that was created by capitalism. His whole point, Mises' whole point here, is that these perceived injustices have nothing to do with free market capitalism, with people owning the factors of production, and with people making their own decision making. It has to do with corruption in countries that refuse to allow people to make those decisions. And a lot of these ideas are based on this false notion that nature distributes to everyone resources equally, which it just doesn't. And so he makes this argument that life is difficult and that life is unfair and that we live in a broken world. I mean, there are some things that he said at the beginning of that passage there that would kind of track on quite nicely to Genesis chapter 3. And he says, given the fact that we live in a broken world, what's the best way to allocate resources? It's through allowing private people to make their own decisions about how those resources are best allocated. And the countries that allow or that give more freedom to private companies and private individuals are almost always better off than those countries that do not do that at all. And he gives another great example. He name drops on page 44 some really important theologians of the 20th century. Here, I'm going to try to flip over to this right here. He says some of the outstanding leaders of present-day Protestantism, and he name drops Barth and Brunner in Switzerland, Niebuhr and Tillich in the U.S., and William Temple, openly condemn capitalism and even charge the alleged failures of capitalism with the responsibility for all the excesses of Russian Bolshevism. He has a lot of really rough things to say about Protestantism and its failure to understand what capitalism actually means. And I think he's right with that critique. As we get ready to wrap up here today, he really, Ludwig von Mises, just as he tries to sum up the problems with mediation between capitalism and socialism, the problem with why we can't seem to overcome this. 3 questions that we need to ask about this today. Number 1, which of the 2 systems, capitalism or socialism, warrants a higher productivity of human effort to improve living standards? And he's going to say that capitalism capitalism, when properly understood, has made people better off. The second one is that there is no economic difference between socialism and communism. Every country that claimed to be communist by default was socialist, and we'll talk about the definition of communism on a later show. But he just goes to say, if you look back at the 20th century, the countries that were communist had the worst economic outcomes, and the countries that were at least nominally capitalist had the best economic outcomes. And then the third point that he makes here, capitalism and socialism are two distinct and antithetical methods of social planning, that you cannot have socialism in a society where people are completely free to produce whatever they want, to consume whatever they want, and where the central government or central planners are not making economic decisions. And again, the whole point here, and Mises and other people in the Austrian tradition are going to make the argument that libertarian-oriented people should want to disconnect from the state. And capitalism, when properly understood, is the only system that allows us to disconnect from that state. And in reality, it's the state that is inherently oppressive. It's not capitalism, it's the state. It's people that make decisions and force them upon other people. And so to challenge at least the economic idea of Michael Gorman, if capitalism allows us to disconnect from the state, which according to the New Testament is inherently oppressive, then shouldn't we do just that? Like, shouldn't we try to seek more open-ended private solutions to the problems that face in our world? The problem with socialism, of course, is that it produces the poverty and the injustice that it seeks to solve. And so when somebody says they're a socialist, what they mean is that they want more government planning, they want more economic control, but as Mises and other Austrians are going to describe in great detail, and we're going to come back to this over and over again on this show, it produces the same level of poverty and injustice that it seeks to solve. And I completely agree with Michael Gorman's contention here that Christians should be generous, but that generosity shouldn't be channeled through the state. We don't need a welfare system. The church does not need a welfare system or anything like that to do the hard work of giving. We just need to step up as a church and give, and we need to take care of the people in our communities that have the greatest needs, and we need to do everything that we can on a private, personal level and within the church to try to make the world a better place. We don't need government-run programs. We don't need central planning. We don't need more economic control and regulation of the economy. What we need is for Christians to step up, to be generous, and to try to solve a lot of these problems from a private background, which, of course, many, many Christians already do. The last thing that I'm going to say here before we wrap up for the week is that, in conclusion, I think that we all as a society need more economic literacy. And I try really hard. Now, in my seventh grade class, I do present capitalism and socialism in an unbiased way. If my students ask me what I think about those issues, I will tell them that I'm a capitalist, but I try to explain to them what those terms actually mean. And anyone that's listening to this show will probably be aware that the education system has not done a great job of helping people understand how society actually works, and I'll have a lot to say about that on future episodes. But my challenge to Protestants who might not be completely comfortable with the idea of capitalism is that we need to do more research. I think we need more economic literacy as a society, and we should do our best to try to understand how these concepts actually work. And if you're here for the Protestant part of it, but you might consider yourself to be more of a socialist, I would highly challenge you to read books on socialism and books on capitalism. I think that it's incredibly helpful to understand where these ideas come from and to try to figure out which ones actually work historically. So my call here is that, again, Ludwig von Mises makes the correct point that Protestants have had a really hard time historically assessing economic commitments. And even though I would say most Protestants today would consider themselves to be Republicans, the Republican Party hasn't done a very good job of articulating or implementing capitalism in our society. And what the Republican Party says about capitalism often has nothing to do with the definition provided either by Mises or in my introductory economics textbooks. And so I think that we need to do a much better job as Protestants of reassessing our economic commitments. And I really do think that it would better help us understand our faith, and it would better help us understand our Bible. The final point that I want to make is that as you're reading Revelation 18, it is not a critique of free market capitalism. It is a critique of exploitation and empire. And we have to ask ourselves, which of these two systems, capitalism or socialism, leads to pain, suffering, and exploitation? All right, next week I'm going to be talking about me. I'm going to be discussing my libertarian conversion, how a kid from Kentucky who grew up reading the Bible in a Lutheran church wound up becoming a libertarian. It's going to be my autobiographical episode. I know if you're listening to this, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this program talking about myself, but I think it is helpful because my experience, my experience kind of transitioning from someone who maybe thought of themselves as a Republican for a little bit and then maybe thought of themselves as a Democrat for a little bit, wound up becoming a libertarian. And so on the show next week, I'm going to be talking about that. So I hope you'll join me for week 4, episode 4 of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. Thank you so much for hanging on today, and we will see you guys soon. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. If you have any questions, comments, or would like to reach out to me about suggestions for future shows, you can contact me at theprotestantlibertarian@gmail.com. That's theprotestantlibertarian@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.